On this day in history, May 1st, 1169, Norman mercenaries land at Bannow Bay in Leinster, marking the beginning of the Norman invasion of Ireland. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Anglo-Norman invasion from 1166 to 1175. Early in his reign, 1155, Henry II of England had, through his envoy, John of Salisbury, received from Adrian IV the grant of Ireland, as an inheritance, on condition that he should reduce to order the Irish Church and State. The so-called Bull, Laudabilter, which defines this grant, rests on the sole authority of Giraldus Cambrensis. How far it is genuine is one of the puzzles of history, but the general submission of the Irish to Henry later would imply that some such papal privilege was in the air. Henry had to put his project aside for the time, and when the invasion came, it was a futile one and directed from South Wales, which was full of Norman adventurers. The first invaders, Maurice Fitzgerald, Robert Fitzstephen, Raymond Le Gros de Carew, and others were sons or grandsons of the famous Welsh Princess Nesta and vassals of Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, called Strongbow, in Irish tradition, Earl of Pembroke. Their opportunity came when Dermot MacMurrough, King of Leinster, expelled by his enemies, decided to seek aid in England and arrived in Bristol with his beautiful daughter Eva, Eof, in August 1166. He was there referred to Henry, found the king in France, was graciously received, and given permission to raise forces in Britain. Returning to Wales, he won Fitzgilbert over by the offer of his daughter's hand with apparently the succession to Leinster. He also enlisted the sons of Nesta in his cause, and they found volunteers among the Welsh and Flemings of South Wales and Pembroke. Returning to Leinster, where his son Donald Kavanagh, whom Giraldus calls illegitimate, was holding out for him, he held his ground until successively Fitzgerald, Fitzstephen, Raymond, and finally Earl Richard himself arrived, the latter landing at Waterford in August 1170 with 200 knights and 1,000 men-at-arms. The successes of Dermot, backed by his professional fighters, were rapid. Danish Waterford was taken, the marriage of Eva and the Earl celebrated, and by a rapid march Dublin also was captured, and a relieving force under the High King scattered, late in 1170. Leinster and Ossory were reduced, but the death of Dermot the following May made the situation difficult. The Irish regarded his son Donald as the true heir, but Fitzgilbert considered himself King of Leinster, and anyway in feudal theory was, in virtue of his wife, lord of the province. But he was hemmed up in Dublin in midsummer by a national levy raised by Rory O'Connor, King of Connaught, and though this attack was repelled, it was uncertain whether he could hold his own. Therefore, when Henry, fearful lest a new Norman state should arise across the Irish Channel, resolved to come to Ireland, Strongbow placed his conquest at his suzerain's feet. Henry landed near Waterford on October 17, 1171, with an imposing army, but a conquest in arms was not necessary, and in fact the peaceful submission of the Irish leaders was prompt and widespread. The king marched to Lismore and Cashel, and finally to Dublin, where he spent the winter, leaving Ireland on April 27, 1172. Into this short period he packed the rough essentials of a government. At Dublin and elsewhere he received the homage of all kings of Ireland except those of Connaught and Ulster. To Strongbow he granted the land of Leinster, confirmed the Geraldines and others in their fiefs, and annexed to the crown the Danish kingdom of Dublin. He gave the capital to the men of Bristol, took the Ostmen under his protection, and appointed Hugh de Lacy governor of the colony. He did not scruple to confer on de Lacy the whole of Meath, though its native king, O'Melaghlin, had recently submitted, and the grant illustrates the inevitable clash of feudal and Irish law. Meanwhile, during the winter, the Irish bishops met at the Council of Cashel, and, after enacting various reforms, declared, according to Giraldus, divine offices shall be celebrated according to the forms of the Church of England, for it is just and right that Ireland has received her Lord and King from England. She should accept Reformation from the same source. This, of course, was an inspired assurance of the task with which the papacy had commissioned Henry. The submission of the Church was complete, nor was it a packed assembly. For though Christian, Bishop of Lismore, and Papal State, seems to have been on Henry's side, Lawrence, Archbishop of Dublin, and the native prelates of Cashel and Tuam were present. Thus was Ireland presented to the English crown as a papal fief. Such was the basis of its authority till 1541, and the Irish themselves accepted the fact. Meanwhile, the adventurers were attacking Desmond, though its king had submitted to Henry. De Lacy was organizing Meath, and John de Courcy conquered in Antrim, and Down, a principality for which he could show no royal patent. Strongbow enfeoffed Leinster deeply with Normans, giving for instance the barony of Naas to Maurice Fitzgerald. Strongbow died in 1176, leaving only a daughter, who later married William, the Earl of Marshall, and brought to him the land of Leinster. Ulster and Connaught were still unconquered, and in 1175, by the Treaty of Windsor, Henry acknowledged Rory O'Connor as the King of Connaught under him. On this day in history, May 2nd, 1670, King Charles II of England grants a permanent charter to the Hudson Bay Company to open up the fur trade in North America. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Hudson Bay Company. Hudson's Bay Company, or the Governor and the Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson Bay. A corporation formed for the purpose of importing into Great Britain the furs and skins which obtains, chiefly by barter, from the Indians of British North America. In 1670, Charles II granted a charter to Prince Rupert and 17 other noblemen and gentlemen, incorporating them as the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay, and securing to them a monopoly of the trade of all lands watered by streams flowing into Hudson Bay. Besides the complete lordship and entire legislative, judicial, and executive power, the corporation received also the right to the whole and entire trade and traffic to and from all havens, bays, creeks, rivers, lakes, and seas into which they shall find entrance or passage by water or land out of the territories, limits, or places aforesaid. The first settlements in the country, thus granted, which was to be known as Rupert's Land, were made on James Bay and at Churchill and Hayes Rivers, but it was long before there was any advance into the interior. For in 1749, when an unsuccessful attempt was made in Parliament to deprive the company of its charter on the plea of non-user, it had only some 4 or 5 forts on the coast, with about 120 regular employees. Although the commercial success of the enterprise was from the first immense, great losses were inflicted on the company by the French. After the cession of Canada to Great Britain in 1763, numbers of fur traders spread over that country and began even to encroach on the Hudson Bay Company's territory. These individual speculators finally combined into the Northwest Fur Company of Montreal. In the competition which arose between the companies, the Indians were demoralized, body and soul, by the abundance of ardent spirits with which the rival traders sought to attract them to themselves. The supply of furs threatened soon to be exhausted by the indiscriminate slaughter, even during the breeding season, of both male and female animals, and the worst passions of both whites and Indians were inflamed to their fiercest. At last, in 1821, the companies amalgamated, obtaining a license to hold for 21 years the monopoly of trade in the vast regions lying to the west and northwest of the older company's grant. In 1838, the Hudson's Bay Company acquired the sole rights for itself and obtained a new license also for 21 years. On the expiry of this, it was not renewed, and since 1859, the district has been open to all. The licenses to trade did not, of course, affect the original possessions of the company. Under the terms of the deed of surrender, dated November 19, 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company surrendered all of its rights of government, subject to certain terms and conditions, including the payment to the company by the Canadian government of a sum of £300,000 sterling on the transfer of Rupert's Land to the Dominion of Canada, the retention by the company of its posts and stations, with a right of selection of a block of land adjoining each post in conformity with a schedule annexed to the deed of surrender, and the right to claim in any township or district within the fertile belt in which land is set out for settlement, grants of land not exceeding 1/20th part of the land so set out. The boundaries of the fertile belt were fixed as follows. On the south by the United States boundary, on the west by the Rocky Mountains, on the north by the northern branch of the Saskatchewan, on the east by Lake Winnipeg, the Lake of the Woods, and the waters connecting them. In 1872, it was agreed that the 1/20th of the lands in the fertile belt reserved to the company under the terms of the deed of surrender should be taken by allotting in every township 2 whole sections of 640 acres each, and in all other townships 1 section and 3/4 of a section each. From this time, little was done to develop the company until just before the outbreak of the World War. During the period 1914 to 18, one part of the company with 300 steamers were engaged in food and munition transport for the French and Belgian governments. From the end of the war, the company began to develop rapidly. The annual reports show a steady increase in business done, and the company is opening new offices in territory hitherto untouched. Large stores are now complete in Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Victoria, and agreements have been made with the United States for the importation of furs to special centers. An experiment in reindeer farming in Baffin's Land failed, but efforts are being made elsewhere, with promises of success. For the past few years, to 1927, the company has ceased trading in Kamchatka and Siberia owing to the rapidly changing authority there. On this day in history, May 3rd, 1815, as part of the Neapolitan War, Joachim Murat, King of Naples, is defeated by the Austrians at the Battle of Tolentino, the decisive engagement of the war. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Tolentino, known in ancient times as Tolentinium Piccinum, a town of the Marches, Italy, in the province of Macerata, 11 miles by rail west by south of that town. Population from 1936, 5,710 in the town, 14,356 in the commune. It is situated on the Chianti, 735 feet above sea level, and was once a fortified town of great strength. The church of St. Nicholas of Tolentino has a fine portal by the Florentine Giovanni Rosso, 1435. At Tolentino, in 1815, a battle was fought in which the French under Murat were defeated by the Austrians. On this day in history, March 4th, 1471, as part of the Wars of the Roses, and during the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward IV defeats a Lancasterian army and kills Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The battle fought on May 3, 1471, closed the long conflict in England of the War of the Roses. The Yorkish victory at Barnet, less than 3 weeks before, marked the ruin of the Lancasterian cause. Tewkesbury was a last desperate venture. Contrary winds had delayed the passage from France of Queen Margaret, wife of the imprisoned King Henry VI, and with a small body of Lancasterian supporters, she landed in the west of England on the day of the disaster at Barnet. With her was her young son, Edward, Prince of Wales. The Duke of Somerset and other survivors of the defeated army a few days later joined her standard. Margaret wished to return to France, but was persuaded that the Lancasterian strength in the west was unbroken. Adherents were recruited from Devon and Somerset as Margaret struck inland towards the Welsh border, hoping to join forces with Jasper Tudor. Edward IV, at Windsor, gathered an army and moved westwards to intercept the invaders, who, after forced marches, found the city of Gloucester hostile and its gates closed against them. They struggled on to Tewkesbury, utterly exhausted. King Edward arrived the same evening. Somerset, commanding the Queen's forces, accepted battle next morning. The position chosen was a strong one, on the gentle slope where the broad Severn flows through the valley. It was much cut up by dikes and hedges, and declivities, through which small watercourses passed, protected both flanks. The town and the river were at the rear. As at Barnet, each opposing army was drawn up in 3 divisions, Edward commanding the Yorkist centre, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and Lord Hastings, the 2 wings. Little impression was made by Edward's attack, till Somerset, whose ranks were being depleted by the fire of the Yorkish artillery and archers, led the Lancasterian right in an impetuous charge on the king's line. It was not supported. Lord Wenlock and the Earl of Devon, with the Lancasterian centre and the left divisions, kept their ground. The charge failed, and Somerset was driven back with heavy loss. He suspected treachery, and in the subsequent rout was said to have cleft the skull of Lord Wenlock with his battle-axe for not taking part in the charge. Pursuing their advantage in the confusion, the Yorkists broke into the Lancasterian main position, forcing their enemy back to the town and Severn banks, where great slaughter ensued. A riverside field to this day bears the name of Bloody Meadow. Edward, Prince of Wales, was slain when crying for mercy. The Earl of Devon and other nobles perished. Somerset himself, with Longstrother the treasurer, and many fugitives gained sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey, from which they were forcibly taken and after summary trial were executed. Next day, Queen Margaret, who had fled into a neighbouring convent, was made prisoner. On the night of Edward IV's return from the victory, King Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London. The death of Edward, Prince of Wales, on the battlefield left the English throne with no direct heir in the Lancasterian line. On this day in history, May 5th, 1260, Kublai Khan becomes ruler of the Mongol Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Great Khan. Kublai Khan, or Khan, as the supreme ruler descended from Genghis, was usually distinctively termed in the 13th century. Born 1216, died 1294. The most eminent of the successors of Genghis, Chinggis, and the founder of the Mongol dynasty in China. He was the second son of Telu, youngest of the 4 sons of Genghis, by his favorite wife. Genghis was succeeded in the khanship by his third son, Okadai, or Ogadai, 1229. He by his son, Koyok, 1246, and Koyok by Mangu, eldest son of Tule, part with his younger brother, Hulagu, afterwards conqueror of the Caliph and founder of the Mongol dynasty in Persia. In the last campaigns of Genghis, 1226-27, the Mongol poetical chronicler, Sanang Setsen, records a tradition that Genghis himself on his deathbed discerned young Kublai's promise and predicted his distinction. Northern China, Cathay, as it was called, had been partially conquered by Genghis himself, and the conquest had been followed up till the Qin, or Golden Dynasty of Tartars, reigning at Kaofengfu on the Yellow River, was completely subjugated, 1234. But China, south of the Yangtze Kiang, remained many years later subject to the native dynasty of Sung, reigning at the great city of Lingang, or Qinsai, now known as Hangzhou-fu. Operations to subdue this region had commenced in 1235, but languished till Mangu's ascension. Kublai was then named his brother's lieutenant in Cathay. The operations were resumed. By what seems a vast and risky strategy, the first campaign of Kublai was directed to the subjugation of the remote western province of Yunnan. After the capture of Tali-Fu, Kublai returned north, leaving the war in Yunnan to a trusted general. Some years later, 1257, the Khan Mangu himself entered on a campaign in West China and died there, before Haochao in Szechuan, 1259. Kublai assumed the succession, but it was disputed by his brother Arkbuga and by his cousin Kaidao, and wars with these retarded the prosecution of the southern conquest. Doubtless, however, the fulfillment of this task was in the mind when he selected as the future capital of his empire the Chinese city now known as Peking. Here, in 1264, to the northeast of the old city, which under the name Yanqing had been an occasional residence of the Qin sovereigns, he founded his new capital, a great rectangular plot of 18 miles in circuit. The so-called Tartar city of modern Peking is the city of Kublai, with about 1/3 at the north cut off, but Kublai's walls are also on this retrenched portion still traceable. The new city, officially firmed Taitu, Great Court, but also among the Mongols and Western peoples as Khan Balig, City of Khan, was finished in 1267. The next year, war against the Song Empire was resumed, but was long retarded by the strenuous defense of the twin cities of Xiangyang and Fenqing on opposite sides of the river Han, and commanding 2 great lines of approach to the basin of the Yangtze Kiang. The siege occupied nearly 5 years. After this Bayan, Kublai's best lieutenant, took command. In 1276, the Sung capital surrendered, and Bayan rode into the city, then probably the greatest in the world, as its conqueror. The young emperor, with his mother, was sent prisoner to Compilai, but 2 younger princes had been dispatched to the south before the fall of the city, and these successfully were proclaimed emperor by the adherents of the native throne. An attempt to maintain their cause was made in Fukien, and afterwards in the province of Kwangtung, but in 1279 these efforts were finally extinguished. The conquest of southern China had occupied the Mongols during half a century of intermittent campaigns, but at last Kublai was ruler of all China, and probably the sovereign, at least nominally, of a greater population than had ever acknowledged one man's supremacy. For, though his rule was disputed by the princes of his house in Turkestan, it was acknowledged by those on the Volga, whose rule reached to the frontier of Poland, and by the family of his brother Hulagu, whose dominion extended from the Oxus to the Arabian desert. For the first time in history, the name and character of an emperor of China were familiar as far west as the Black Sea and not unknown in Europe. The Chinese seals which Kublai conferred on his kinsmen reigning at Tabriz are stamped upon their letters to the kings of France and survive in the archives of Paris. Adventurers from Turkestan, Persia, Armenia, Byzantium, even from Venice, served him as ministers, generals, governors, envoys, astronomers, or physicians. Soldiers from all Asia to the Caucasus fought his battles in the south of China. Once in his old age, 1287, Kublai was compelled to take the field in person against a serious revolt, raised by Nayan, a prince of his family who held a vast domain on the borders of Manchuria. Nayan was taken and executed. The revolt had been stirred up by Kaidu, who survived his imperial rival and died in 1301. Kublai himself died in 1294, at the age of 78. Though a great figure in Asiatic history, Kublai misses a record in the short list of the good rulers. He was the first of his race to rise above the innate barbarism of the Mongols, and he retained the force and warlike character of his ancestors. He had great intelligence and a keen desire for knowledge, with apparently a good deal of natural benevolence and magnanimity. But his love of splendor and his fruitless expeditions beyond sea created enormous demands for money, and he shut his eyes to the character and methods of his agents. A remarkable narrative of the oppression of one of these, Ahmed of Feneket, and of the revolt which they provoked, is given by Marco Polo, in substantial accordance with the Chinese annals. Kublai patronized Chinese literature and culture generally. The great astronomical instruments which he caused to be made were long preserved at Peking, but were carried off to Berlin in 1900. Though he put hardly any Chinese into the first ranks of his administration, he attached many to his confidence, and was personally popular among them. He made efforts to procure European priests for the instruction of his people, of which were known through Marco Polo. Failing this momentary effort, Kublai probably saw in the organized force of Tibetan Buddhism the readiest instrument in the civilization of his countrymen, and that system received his special countenance. Early in his reign he appointed a young lama of intelligence and learning, Bhante Duwaja, the head of the Lamite Church, and eventually also Prince of Tibet. The ecclesiastic was employed by Kublai to devise a special alphabet for use with the Mongol language. It was chiefly based on Tibetan forms of Nagari. Some coins and inscriptions in it are extant, but it soon perished. Of the splendor of his court and entertainments, of his palaces, summer and winter, of the great hunting expeditions, of his revenues and extraordinary paper currencies, of his elaborate system of posts and much else, an account is given in the books of Marco Polo, who passed many years in Kublai's service. His foreign expeditions were almost all disastrous. Nearly all rose out of a hankering for the nominal extension of his empire by claiming submission and tribute. Expeditions against Japan were several times repeated. The last, in 1281, on an immense scale, met with huge discomfiture. Kublai's preparations to avenge it were abandoned owing to the intense discontent which they created. In 1278 he made a claim of submission upon Champa, Cochin China. An attempt to invade the country through Tongking led to a war with that state, in which the Mongols had much the worst of it. A war with Burma, or Mien as the Chinese called it, were more favorable to Kublai's arms. The country was overrun as far as the Irrawaddy Delta, the ancient capital, Pagan, with its magnificent temples destroyed, and the old royal dynasty overthrown. The last attempt of the kind was against Java, and occurred in the last year of the old Khan's reign. The envoy whom he had commissioned to claim homage was sent back with ignominy. A great armament was equipped in the ports of Fukien to avenge this insult. But after some temporary success, the force was compelled to re-embark with a loss of 3,000 men. The death of Kublai prevented further action. Some other expeditions in which force was not used gratified the Khan's vanity by bringing back professions of homage with presents, and with the curious reports of foreign countries in which Kublai delighted. Such expeditions extended to the states of southern India, to eastern Africa, and even to Madagascar. Of Kublai's 12 legitimate sons, Chinkim, the favorite and designated successor, died in 1284-85, and Timur, the son of Chinkim, took his place. No great king arose in the dynasty after Kublai. He had in all 9 successors of his house on the throne of Khan Balig, but the long and imbecile reign of the 9th Toghon Timur ended 1368 in disgrace and expulsion, and the native dynasty of Ming reigned in their stead. On this day in history, May 6, 1682, Louis XIV of France moves his court to the Palace of Versailles. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the palace. Louis XIII often hunted in the woods of Versailles and built a small pavilion at the corner of what is now the Rue de la Pompe and the Avenue of St. Cloud. In 1627, he entrusted Jacques Lemercier with the plans of a chateau. In 1661, Louis le Vieux made some additions which were further developed by him in 1668. In 1678, Monsart took over the work, the Galerie des Glaces, the chapel, and the 2 wings being due to him. In 1682, Louis XIV took up his residence in the chateau. Till his time, the town was represented by a few houses to the south of the present Place des Armes. But land was given to the lords of the court, and new houses sprung up, chiefly in the north quarter. Under Louis XV, the parish of St. Louis was formed to the south for the increasing population, and new streets were built to the north on the meadows of Clagny. Under Louis XVI, the town extended to the east and received a municipality. In 1802, it gave its name to a bishopric. In 1783, the armistice preliminary to the Treaty of Peace between Great Britain and the United States was signed at Versailles. The States General met here on the 5th of May, 1789, and on the 20th of June took the solemn oath in the tennis court, by which they bound themselves not to separate till they had given France a constitution. Napoleon neglected, and Louis XVIII and Charles X merely kept up Versailles, but Louis Philippe made great alterations, some of which were later altered back to the original designs, partly with the help of a large gift from the USA. In 1870 and 1871, the town was the headquarters of the German army besieging Paris, and in the Galerie des Glaces, William I of Prussia was crowned German Emperor in 1871. After the Peace of Versailles was the seat of the French National Assembly, while the Commune was triumphant in Paris, and of the 2 chambers till 1879 being declared the official capital of France. After World War I, the treaty between the Allied powers and Germany was signed in the Galerie des Glaces. During World War II, Versailles was occupied by the Germans at the same time as Paris, June 1940. On this day in history, May 7, 1487, the siege of Malaga commences during the Spanish Reconquista. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the city. Malaga, the capital of the province of Malaga, an episcopal see, and next to Barcelona, the most important seaport of Spain, finely situated on the Mediterranean coast at the southern base of the Axarquia Hills and at the eastern extremity of the fertile Vega plain of Malaga, in 36 degrees 43 minutes north and 4 degrees 25 minutes west. Population of 1940, 234,913. The climate is mild and equable, the mean annual temperature being 66.7 degrees. The principal railway inland gives access through Bobadilla to all parts of Spain, with a branch line along the coast to Velez, Malaga. Malaga is the Malac of Strabo and Ptolemy, and the Malacca Torre de Torum of Pliny. The place seems to have been of some importance even during the Carthaginian period. Under the Romans it became a municipum, and under the Visigoths an episcopal see. In 711 it passed into the possession of the Moors, and soon came to be regarded as one of the most important cities of Andalusia. It was attached to the Caliphate of Cordova, but on the fall of the Umayyad dynasty, it became, for a short time, the capital of an independent kingdom. Afterwards it was dependent on Granada. In 1487, it was taken by Ferdinand and Isabella after a protracted siege. In 1810, it was sacked by the French. It was captured February 8, 1937, by the nationalist general Quepo de Llano. Malaga lies principally on the left bank of the Guadalmedina, river of the city. The streets near the sea are comparatively modern and well built. Suburbs have spread into the rich and pleasant country which surrounds the city. The Plaza de Rigo, the Plaza de la Constitucion, and the Paseo de la Alameda are important. The cathedral, on the site of an ancient mosque, was begun about 1528. After its construction had been twice interrupted, it was completed to its present state in the 18th century. The castle of Gibralfaro, on the rock to the northeast, dates from the 13th century. New harbor works were undertaken in 1880, and all vessels can load or discharge at the quays, which are connected with the main railway system by a branch line. Iron, lead, wine, olive oil, brandy, almonds, fresh and dried fruit, hats, and canary seed are exported in large quantities. Imports include petroleum, grain, codfish, fuel, chemicals, iron and steel, machinery, and manures. There are large cotton mills, iron foundries, smelting works, and engineering works. The industries include tanning, distilling, and the manufacture of sugar, chocolate, soap, candles, artificial ice, chemical products, white lead, and pianos. On this day in history, May 8, 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny is drafted between King Edward III of England and King John II of France, also known as the Good. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the village. Bretigny, French hamlet, department of Eure-et-Loir, arrondissement and canton of Chartres, commune of Sours, which gave its name of a treaty concluded there on May 8, 1360, between Edward III of England and John II of France. Edward III obtained besides Guienne and Gascony, Poitou, Saint-Yon, and Aunis, Argien, Perigord, Limousin, Quercy, Bigorre, the courtship of Guerre, Angoulême, Rouerre, Montreuil-sur-Mer, Ponthieu, Calais, Sanguet, Ham, and the courtship of Guienne. John II had moreover to pay 3 million gold crowns for his ransom. On his side, the King of England gave up the duchies of Normandy and Touraine, the courtships of Anjou and Maine, and the suzerainty of Brittany and of Flanders. The treaty should more properly be called the Treaty of Calais, since it was ratified there on October 24th, when an important clause in the Treaty of Bretigny was omitted. On this day in history, May 9th, 1662, the figure who later became Mr. Punch makes his first recorded appearance in England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Punch. Punch, the abbreviated form of Puccinello, Italian Policinella, the most popular of the puppets or marionettes, and the chief figure in the Punch and Judy show. It is of Italian origin, though its history is by no means free from obscurity. The early etymologists sought to trace the name to various mythological individuals, by whom it was alleged the type was first furnished. Father Galani adopts the theory, which derives it from the name of Puccio de Aniello, a vintager of Acerra, near Naples, who, having by his wit and grotesque appearance vanquished some strolling comedians in their own sphere, was induced to join the troupe, and whose place, by reason of his popularity, was supplied after his death by a masked actor who imitated his dress and manner. The claims of other individuals, Paolo Sinella, Policeno, and Pulcinella, a Neapolitan dealer in fowls, have also found supporters, and the derivation of the name and character from some old mystery representing Pontius, or in English, Pounce, French, Ponce. Pilate and Judas, or the Jews, was formerly popular. It has even been suggested that the title is a modification of the Greek meaning, I move much, as expressive of the restlessness which is characteristic of the puppet, and the assumption that the character was invariably of diminutive size has given rise to its reference to the word pollis, the thumb. The most plausible theory, however, regards the name in its Italian form as a diminutive of poccino, feminine of poccina, a chicken. It is sometimes stated that, in consequence of the habit of using the word chicken as a term of endearment, it came to mean a little child, and hence a puppet. The choice, however, seems to lie between the theory of Quadrio, that it was applied on account of the resemblance of the hooked nose to a beak, and that of J. Baretti, which ascribes its employment to the nasal squeak and timorous impotence of the original character. With respect to the development of the modern type, it has been assumed that the whole family of Italian maschere, Aralicino, Brighella, and the like, are modified survivals of the principal Oscan characters of the Atellania, and that Puccinello is the representative of Maccus, the fool or clown. In proof of this, it is urged that Acerra, the supposed residence of Puccio de Aniello, and the traditional source of the character, is in the neighborhood of Aversa, the old Atella, and reference is also made to the bronze statue of Maccus discovered at Rome in 1727, an engraving of which has been preserved in Faccaroni's Le Machiere Sanchez e la Figura Comique de Antonucci Romani. But the resemblance of the statue to the puppet is scarcely a striking one, and the large nose and deformed figure are somewhat hazardous ground on which to base the theory. Andrea Porrucci, 1699, and Gimma assert with some show of authority that Silvio Foriello, a comedian named after his principal part, Captain Matamoros, the Italian Miles Gloriosus, invented the Neapolitan Pulcinella. It was afterwards improved by Andrea Calchesi, surnamed Giotto, who died of the plague in 1656, and who, according to Gimma, imitated in the character the peasants of Acerra. This would place the origin of the Italian Pulcinella somewhere about the commencement of the 17th century, the original character appearing to have been that of a country clown, hook-nosed, shrill-voiced, cowardly, boastful, and often stupid, yet given at times to knavish tricks and shrewd sayings. In through accordance with this date, we find that the earliest known appearance of Pulcinella in France is at the beginning of the reign of Louis XIV, in the show of the puppet-playing dentist Jean Baroche. The date of its introduction into England has been disputed, J. Payne Collier being of the opinion that Punch and King William came together, a second theory suggesting an earlier origin with the Huguenot refugees. It is more than probable that it crossed the Channel in the wake of the Royalists, apart from the general references by S. Pepys, 1662, and by J. Evelyn, 1667, to an Italian puppet show at Covent Garden. The former mentions, 1669, of some poor people who called their fat child Punch, that word being become a word of common use for all that is thick and short. An allusion to Punchinellos is also to be found in Butler's satire of English imitation of the French, and Aubrey speaks of a Punchinello holding a dial as one of the ornaments of Sir Samuel Lely's house at Whitehall. But though the puppet did not travel in the train of William of Orange, allusions to it became far more frequent after the Revolution of 1688, and the skill of the Dutch in their treatment of puppet mechanisms may have enhanced its attractiveness. In 1703 it was introduced at Bartholomew Fair into a puppet play of the creation of the world. In 1709 it was found in a representation of the deluge, though in a different part from that of Momus Pulcinella. And in 1710 it is mentioned as a leading figure in Powell's puppet show at Covent Garden. The alleged satire on Robert Walpole, entitled A Second Tale of a Tub, or The History of Robert Powell, the Puppet Showman, 1715, furnishes some details of Punch performances, and has an interesting frontispiece representing Powell with Punch and his wife. The Judy, or Joan, as she appears to have been sometimes called, is not of a specifically grotesque order, but the punch is easily recognizable in all but the features, which are of the normal puppet type. The older Puccinello was far less restricted in his actions and circumstances than his modern successor. He fought with allegorical figures representing wanton weariness, as well as with his wife and with the police, was on intimate terms with the patriarchs and the 7 champions of Christendom, sat on the lap of the Queen of Sheba, had kings and dukes for his companions. Powell seems to have introduced a trained pig, which danced a minuet with Punch and the French, among whom Punch is now usually styled Guignol, originally a puppet hailing from Lyon. Occasionally employed a cat in the place of the dog Toby, whose origin is somewhat uncertain. A typical version of the modern play, with illustrations, was published by Payne Collier and Cruikshank in 1828. On this day in history, May 10th, 1503, Christopher Columbus visits the Cayman Islands and names them Las Tortugas after the numerous turtles there. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the islands. Cayman Islands, 3 low-lying islands in the West Indies, Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, and Cayman Brac, are situated between 79 degrees 44 minutes and 80 degrees 26 minutes west, and 19 degrees 46 minutes north, forming a dependency of Jamaica, which lies 178 miles east by southeast. Grand Cayman, a flat rock-bound island protected by coral reefs, is 17 miles long, and varies from 4 miles to 7 miles in breadth. It has 2 towns, Georgetown and Bowdentown. Little Cayman and Cayman Brac are both about 70 miles, east by northeast of Grand Cayman. The soil is shallow but not infertile. Some small mahogany and other timber and dyewoods are grown. Large quantities of coconuts are produced in the smaller islands. Phosphate deposits are worked, but the most lucrative occupation is catching turtles for export to Jamaica. The white people are of fine physique and excellent shipwrights, and do trade in schooners built locally. The government is administered by a commissioner, and the laws passed by the local legislature are subject to the assent of the governor of Jamaica. Population, estimated from 1938, 6,850. The islands were discovered by Columbus, who named them Tortugas, from the turtles with which the surrounding seas abound. They were never occupied by the Spaniards and were colonized from Jamaica by the British. On this day in history, May 11th, 973, in the first coronation ceremony ever held for an English monarch, Edgar the Peaceful is crowned King of England, having ruled since 959. His wife, Ealhthrife, is crowned Queen, the first recorded coronation for a Queen of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Edgar. Edgar, or Eadgar, King of the English from 944 to 975, was the younger son of Edmund the Magnificent and Elfgifu. As early as 955, he signed a charter of his uncle Eadred, and in 957 the Mercian nobles, discontented with the rule of his elder brother, Eadwig, made him king of England north of the Thames. On the death of his brother, in October 959, Edgar became king of a unified England. Immediately on his ascension to the throne of Mercia, Edgar recalled St. Dunstan from exile and made him first bishop of Worcester, and then of London. In 961, Dunstan was translated to Canterbury, and throughout Edgar's reign he was his chief adviser, and to him must be attributed much of the peace and prosperity of this time. The reign of Edgar was somewhat uneventful, but 2 things stand out clearly: his ecclesiastical policy and his imperial position in Britain. Edgar and Dunstan were alike determined to reform the great monastic houses, to restore them to their true owners, and to remove them from the tax discipline of the secular priests, or canonici. The priests of the old and new monasteries at Winchester, Chertsey, and Milton Abbas were replaced by monks, and the old rule of St. Benedict was strictly enforced. The coronation of Edgar, delayed for some unexplained reason till 973, took place with much ceremony at Bath, and was followed shortly after by submission of 8 kings, including the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde, to Edgar at Chester. In 967, an outbreak against Edgar in Northumbria was put down by Thored, the son of Gunneir, steward of the king's household. Edgar's death took place in the year 975, and he was buried at Glastonbury. By his vigorous rule and his statesmanlike policy, Edgar won the approval of his people. The only fault ascribed to him is a too great love for foreigners and for foreign customs. Edgar strengthened the hands of the provincial administration and allowed the northern Danes a certain degree of self-government. Edgar is said to have formed an irregular union in 961 with Wulfrith, an inmate of the convent of Wilton, who bore him a daughter, Eadgith, but refused to marry him. He married Ethelflaed, the White Duck, daughter of Earl Ordmer, who bore him a son, known as Edward the Martyr. Finally, he was united, 964, to Ealhthryth, daughter of Earl Ordgar, who became the mother of Etheling Edmund, died 971, and of Ethelred the Unready. On this day in history, May 12, 254, Pope Stephen I succeeds Pope Lucius I, becoming the 23rd Pope of the Catholic Church, and immediately takes a stand against Novatianism. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Pope Stephen I. Stephen I, Bishop of Rome from about 254 to 257, followed Lucius I. He withdrew from church fellowship with Cyprian and certain Asiatic bishops on account of their views as to the necessity of the rebaptizing of heretics. He is also mentioned as having insisted on the restoration of the bishops of Meridia and Astorga, who had been deposed from unfaithfulness during persecution, but afterwards had repented. He is commemorated on August 2nd. His successor was Sextus II. On this day in history, May 13th, 1638, Richard Simon, a French priest and scholar, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Simon. Richard Simon, born 1638, died 1712, French biblical critic. Born at Dieppe on May 13, 1638, was educated by the fathers of the oratory at Dieppe and at the University of Paris. Simon entered the priesthood in 1670, and the same year wrote a pamphlet in defense of the Jews of Metz, who had been accused of having murdered a Christian child. About this time began his controversies with the Port Royalists and with the Benedictines, and his enemies sought to drive him from Paris. He was engaged at the time in superintending the printing of his Histoire critique des Vieux Testament, which was to be dedicated to Louis XIV. The proof sheets were held up pending the return of the king from Flanders, and fell into the hands of the Port Royalists, who had in hand a translation into French of the Prolegomena to Walton's Polyglot. Simon now announced his intention of publishing an annotated edition of the Prolegomena, and actually added to the Critical History a translation of the last 4 chapters of that work, which had formed no part of his original plan. Simon's announcement prevented the appearance of the projected translation, but his enemies found the desired opportunity in the alleged heterodoxy of some of the views expressed by Simon. A decree of the Council of State was obtained, and the whole impression, consisting of 1,300 copies, was seized by the state and destroyed. Simon was expelled by the Oratorians from their fellowship, and retired in 1679 to his curacy of Bouleville, Normandy. Finally, the Critical History appeared with Simon's name on the title page in the year 1685, from the press of Renier Leers in Rotterdam. Simon died at Dieppe on April 11th, 1712. On this day in history, May 14th, 1940, as part of World War II, Rotterdam in the Netherlands is bombed by the Luftwaffe of Nazi Germany despite a ceasefire, killing about 900 people and destroying the historic city center. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Rotterdam, a city of the Netherlands in the province of South Holland, on both banks of the New Maas, at the confluence of the canalized Rotte, and at a junction station 14.5 miles by rail south by southeast of The Hague. The population of the city, the principal Dutch port, was about 20,000 in 1632, 53,212 in 1796, 105,858 in 1860, 379,017 in 1905, and 612,372 in 1940. Rotterdam probably owes its existence to the 2 castles which existed in feudal times. In 1299, John I, Count of Holland, granted to the people of Rotterdam the same rights as were enjoyed by the burghers of Beverwyck, which were identical with those of Haarlem. This privilege marks the origin of the town. It continued to increase in size, various extensions of its boundaries being made, and its trading importance is to a large extent the result of its commercial intercourse with England. Its shipping facilities made it the first commercial city of Holland, and the third largest port on the continent. By means of the new waterway, from 1869 to 90, to the Hook of Holland, it is accessible for the largest ships. Ships drawing 24 feet can come up at any time, and those drawing 24 to 33 feet at high water. The length of the quays is about 16 miles. The river is spanned by a road bridge from 1878 and a railway bridge 1877 passing from the Boompies to the North Island, whence they are continued to the farther shore by swing bridges, through which the largest ships can pass to the upper river. These bridges prove useful in breaking up the ice which forms above them in winter. On the south side of the river are numerous large docks and wharves, which were enlarged after World War I, while the city proper on the north side consists of a labyrinth of basins and canals with tree-bordered quays. These were bombed systematically by the Germans during the invasion of May 10 to 14, 1940, and later by the Allied air forces. In the center of the town is the Beursplein, or Exchange Square. Behind the exchange is the great marketplace, built on vaulting over a canal, and containing a bronze statue of Erasmus, who was born in Rotterdam in 1467. The statue is the work of Hendrik de Keyser, and was erected in 1622 to replace an older one. Beyond the marketplace is the High Street, which runs along the top of the Maas Dyke. On the west of the city, a pretty road leads from the Zoological Gardens, 1857, on the north to a small park, which contains a statue of the popular poet Hendrik Tollens, died 1856, a native of the city. Among the churches of Rotterdam is an English church, originally built by the first Duke of Marlborough, whose arms may be seen with the royal arms over the entrance. The Grootkerk, or Lawrence-kerk, end of the 15th century, contains a fine brass screen, 1715, a celebrated organ with nearly 5,000 pipes, and the monuments of Admiral Witte de With, died 1658, and other Dutch naval heroes. In the New Market adjoining is a fountain adorned with sculptures erected in 1874 to commemorate the Jubilee of the Restoration of Dutch Independence, 1813. The museums of the city comprise an ethnographical museum, the Maritime Museum, established by the Yacht Club in 1874, and the Boijmans Museum, 1867, containing pictures, drawings, and engravings, as well as the town library. Of the original collection of pictures bequeathed by F.J.O. Boijmans in 1847, more than half was destroyed by the fire in 1864, but the collection has been enlarged since and is representative of both ancient and modern artists. In 1935, the Boijmans Museum was erected outside the business center of the city. It contains some of the most famous masterpieces of Dutch art and an extremely fine collection of old Delft china. Close to the museum is a statue of the statesman Gijsbert Karel van Hagendorp, 1762 to 1834, a native of the city. Among the remaining buildings must be mentioned the old town hall, 17th century, restored 1823, the new town hall, the concert hall of the Harmonic Club, the record office, 1900, the Lees Cabinet, or subscription library, and reading rooms, and the 10-storied Wiet Huis, 1897, which is used for offices and is one of the highest private buildings on the continent. On May 14, 1940, shortly after the Dutch had ceased resistance to the German invaders, enemy bombers completely destroyed the business center of Rotterdam. An estimated 25,000 to 30,000 people were killed in the raid. The industries comprise the manufacture of tobacco, cigars, margarine, rope, leather, etc., and there are breweries, distilleries, and sugar refineries. Shipbuilding yards extend above and below the city, one of the earliest being that of the Netherlands Steamboat Company, 1825. It is, however, as a commercial rather than as a manufacturing city that Rotterdam became distinguished, its progress in this respect having been very striking. Between 1850 and 1902, the area of the port was increased from 96 to more than 300 acres. Rotterdam ordinarily has a great transit trade of goods in bulk, and, besides its maritime trade, it has an extensive river traffic. Its overseas trade is principally with the Dutch colonies, New York, La Plata, and the east and west coasts of Africa. The great harbor works on the south side of the river, required to accommodate this growing trade, were planned by Stilges. Died 1878. On this day in history, May 15th, 392, Emperor Valentinian II is assassinated while advancing into Gaul against the Frankish usurper Urbogast. He is found hanging in his residence at Vienne. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Valentinian. Valentinian II, son of Valentinian I, an infant of 4 in 375 with his half-brother Gratian, a lad of about 17, became the emperors of the West. They made Milan their home, and the empire was nominally divided between them, Gratian taking the Transalpine provinces, whilst Italy, Illyricum in part, and Africa were to be under the rule of Valentinian, or rather of his mother, Justina. In 387, Magnus Maximus, who had in 383 overthrown Gratian and made himself master of the northern provinces, crossed the Alps and threatened Milan. The emperor and his mother fled to Theodosius, the emperor of the East. Valentinian was restored in 388 by Theodosius. 4 years later, he was murdered at Vienne in Gaul, probably at the instigation of his Frankish general, Arbogast. On this day in history, May 16th, 1527, the Florentines drive out the Medici for a second time, and Florence reestablishes itself as a republic. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the second expulsion of the Medici. Cardinal Passerini's regency proved most unpopular, and the city was soon seething with discontent. Revolts broke out, and Passerini showed himself quite unequal to the situation. The nobles were mostly anti-Medician, and when Filippo Strozzi, and above all his wife, threw their influence in the scales against the Medici, and the magistrates declared for their expulsion from power, Passerini, Ippolito, and Alessandro left Florence, May 17, 1527. A Consiglio degli Scelti was summoned, and a constitution similar to that of Savonarola's time was established. The Greater Council was revived, and Niccolò Caponi created Gonfaloniere for a year. But Florence was torn by factions. Having been re-elected Gonfaloniere, in spite of much opposition in 1528, Caponi tried to make peace with the Pope. But his correspondence with the Vatican resulted in a quite unjustified charge of high treason, and although acquitted, he had to resign office and leave the city for 6 months. Francesco Carducci was elected Gonfaloniere in his place, and on June 29, 1529, the Pope and the Emperor concluded a treaty by which the latter agreed to re-establish the Medici to Florence. On this day in history, May 17, 1590, Anne of Denmark is crowned Queen of Scotland. Including in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Anne. Anne of Denmark, born 1574, died 1619, Queen of James I of England and VI of Scotland, daughter of King Frederick II of Denmark and Norway, and of Sophia, daughter of Ulrich III, Duke of Mecklenburg, was born on December 12, 1574. On August 20th, 1589, in spite of Queen Elizabeth's opposition, she was married by proxy to King James, without dower, the alliance, however, settling definitely the Scottish claims to the Orkney and Shetland Islands. The birth of an heir to the throne, Prince Henry, in 1594 strengthened her position and influence, but the young prince was immediately withdrawn from her care and entrusted to the keeping of the Earl and Countess of Mar at Stirling Castle. In 1595, James gave a written command, forbidding them, in case of his death, to give up the prince to the queen till he reached the age of 18 years. On the death of Queen Elizabeth on March 24, 1603, Anne took advantage of James's absence to demand possession of the prince, and, at the flat refusal of the Countess of Mar, fell into a passion, the violence of which occasioned a miscarriage and endangered her life. In June she followed the king to England, with the prince and the coffin containing the body of her dead infant, and reached Windsor on July 2nd. On July 24th, Anne was crowned with the king, when her refusal to take the sacrament according to the Anglican use created some sensation. Notwithstanding religious differences, she lived in great harmony and affection with the king, latterly, however, residing mostly apart. She helped to raise Buckingham to power in the place of Somerset, maintained friendly relations with him, and approved of his guidance and control of the king. In spite of her birth and family, she was at first favorably inclined to Spain, disapproval of her daughter Elizabeth's marriage with the Elector Palatine, and supported the Spanish marriages for her sons, but subsequently veered around towards France. She used all her influence in favor of the unfortunate Raleigh, answering his petition to her for protection with a personal letter of appeal to Buckingham to save his life. Her interest in state matters was only occasional, and secondary to the preoccupations of court festivities, dresses, jewels, which she much enjoyed. The court being, says Wilson, whose severity cannot entirely suppress his admiration, a continued masquerado, where she and her ladies, like so many nymphs of Nereides, appeared, to the ravishment of the beholders, and made the night more glorious than the day. Her extravagant expenditure, returned by the Chamberlain at her death at more than £84,000, was unfavorably contrasted with the economy of Queen Elizabeth. Her debts in 1616 were reckoned at nearly £10,000, while her jewelry and her plate were valued at her death at nearly £500,000. Anne died after a long illness on March 2, 1619, and she was buried in Westminster Abbey. She was generally regretted. She was intelligent and tactful, a faithful wife, a devoted mother, and a staunch friend. Besides several children who died in infancy, she had Henry, Prince of Wales, who died in 1612, Charles, afterwards King Charles I, and Elizabeth, Electress Palatine and Queen of Bohemia. On this day in history, May 18th, 872, Louis II of Italy is crowned for the second time as Holy Roman Emperor at Rome at the age of 47. His first coronation was 28 years earlier, in 844, during the reign of his father, Lothair I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Louis. Louis II, born 1825, died 875, Roman Emperor. Eldest son of the Emperor Lothair I, was designated King of Italy in 839, and was crowned king at Rome by Pope Sergius II on June 15th, 844. In 850, he was crowned joint emperor at Rome by Pope Leo IV, and soon afterwards married his cousin, Engelberga, a daughter of King Louis the German, and undertook the independent government of Italy. On the death of his father, in 855, he became sole emperor. In 857, he allied himself with Louis the German against his brother Lothair, King of Lorraine, and King Charles the Bald, but after he had secured the election of Nicholas I as Pope in 858, he became reconciled with his brother. In 863, on the death of his brother Charles, Louis received the kingdom of Provence. In 864, he quarreled with Pope Nicholas I over his brother's divorce, which the Pope had declared invalid, and in February reached Rome with an army, but made peace with the Pope and left the city. In 866, he routed the Saracens, but could not follow up his successes, owing to the want of a fleet. In 869, with the assistance of his ally, the Eastern Emperor, Basil I, he captured Bari, the headquarters of the Saracens. He had withdrawn into Benevento to prepare for a further campaign, when he was treacherously robbed and imprisoned by Adelchis, Prince of Benevento, in August 871, but was released a month later. Returning to Rome, he was crowned a second time as emperor by Pope Adrian II on May 18, 872. After further successes against the Saracens, who were driven from Capua, he returned to northern Italy. He died, somewhere in the province of Brescia, on August 12, 875, and was buried in the church of St. Ambrose at Milan, having named as his successor in Italy his cousin Carloman, son of Louis the German. On this day in history, May 19th, 715, Pope Gregory II is elected. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Gregory. Gregory II, Pope from 715 to 731, succeeded Constantine I, whom he accompanied to Constantinople in 710. To spread Christianity in Germany, Gregory gave special encouragement to the mission of St. Boniface, whom he consecrated bishop in 722. He was a staunch adherent of the East Roman Empire, which still exercised sovereignty over Rome, Ravenna, and some other parts of Italy, and he impeded as far as possible the progress of the Lombards. About 726, however, he came into conflict with the Emperor Leo the Isaurian on account of the excessive taxation of the Italians, and later on account of his iconoclastic edicts. Leo endeavored to rid himself of the Pope by violence, but Gregory, supported by the people of Rome and by the Lombards, succeeded in eluding the emperor and died peacefully on February 11th, 731. On this day in history, May 20th, 1217, the Second Battle of Lincoln is fought near Lincoln, England, resulting in the defeat of Prince Louis of France by William Marshal, 1st Earl of Pembroke. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Lincoln. The British London, which according to the early geographer Ptolemy was the chief town of the Corytani, was probably the nucleus of the Roman town of Linden. This was at first a Roman legionary fortress, and on the removal of the troops northward was converted into a municipality with the title of Colonia. Important structural remains attest the rank and importance of the place, which, however, did not attain a very great size. Its bishop attended the Council of Arles in 314, and Lincoln, Lindocolina, Lincoln, Nicole, is mentioned in the itinerary of Antonius written about 320. Although said to have been captured by Hengist in 475 and recovered by Ambrosius in the following year, the next authentic mention of the city is Bede's record that Paulinus preached in Lindsey in 628 and built a stone church at Lincoln in which he consecrated Honorius, Archbishop of Canterbury. The Danes in 877 established themselves at Lincoln, which was one of the 5 boroughs recovered by King Edmund in 941. A mint existed here in the reign of Alfred and was maintained until the reign of Edward I. At the time of Doomsday, Lincoln was governed by 12 lawmen, relics of Danish rule, each with hereditable franchises of sack and salk. The strength of the position of the castle built by William I in 1068 brought much fighting on Lincoln. In 1141, King Stephen regained both castle and city from the Empress Maud, but was attacked and captured in the same year at the Joust of Lincoln. In 1144, he besieged the castle held by the Earl of Chester and recovered it as a pledge in 1146. In 1191, it was held by Gerald de Camville for Prince John. In 1210, it stood a siege by the partisans of the French Prince Louis, who were defeated at the battle called Lincoln Fair on May 19th, 1217. Granted by Henry III to William Longsby, Earl of Salisbury, in 1224, the castle descended by the marriage of his descendant Alice to Thomas Plantagenet, and became part of the Duchy of Lancaster. In 1157, Henry II gave the citizens their first charter, granting them the city at a fee-farm rent and all the liberties which they had under William II. In 1200, the citizens obtained release from all but pleas of the crown without the walls, and pleas of external tenure, and were given the pleas of the crown within the city according to the customs of the city of London, on which those of Lincoln were modeled. The charter also gave them quittance of toll and lastage throughout the kingdom, and of certain other dues. The mayor's office was abolished by Henry III and by Edward I in 1290, though restored by the charter of 1300. In 1275, the citizens claimed the return of writs, assize of bread and ale, and other royal rights. And in 1301, Edward I, when confirming the previous charters, gave them quittance of murage, pannage, pottage, and other dues. The mayor and citizens were given criminal jurisdiction in 1327, when the Burgmanmat was ordered to hear all local pleas which led to friction with the judges of assize. The city became a separate county by the charter of 1409, when it was decreed that the bailiffs should henceforth be sheriffs, and the mayor the king's exchequer, and the mayor and sheriffs, with 4 others, justices of the peace, with defined jurisdiction. As the result of numerous complaints of the inability to pay the fee-farm rent of £180, Edward IV enlarged the bounds of the city in 1466, while Henry VIII in 1546 gave the citizens 4 advowsons, and possibly also in consequence of the declining trade, the city markets were made free of tolls in 1554. Incorporated by Charles I in 1628 under a common council with 13 aldermen, 4 coroners, and other officers, Lincoln surrendered its charters in 1684, but the first charter was restored after the Revolution, and was in force till 1834. Parliaments were held at Lincoln in 1301, 1316, and 1328, and the city returned 2 burgesses from 1295 to 1885, when it lost 1 member. After the 13th century, the chief interests of Lincoln were ecclesiastical and commercial. As early as 1103, Odoricus declared that a rich citizen of Lincoln kept the treasure of King Magnus of Norway, supplying him with all he required. And there is other evidence of intercourse with Scandinavia. There was an important Jewish colony, Aaron of Lincoln being one of the most influential financiers in the kingdom between 1166 and 1186, made a staple of wool, leather, and skins in 1291, famous for its scarlet cloth in the 13th century. Lincoln had a few years of great prosperity, but with the transference of the staple to Boston early in the reign of Edward III, its trade began to decrease. The craft guilds remained important until after the Reformation, a pageant still being held in 1566. The fair now held during the last whole week of April seems to be identical with that granted by Charles II in 1684. Edward III authorized a fair from St. Botolph's Day to the feast of Saints Peter and Paul in 1327. Henry IV granted one in 1409 for 15 days before the feast of the deposition of St. Hugh, and William III gave one for the first Wednesday in September 1696. On this day in history, May 21st, 878, Syracuse, Sicily is captured by the Muslim Aghlabids after a 9-month siege. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Syracuse following the Roman capture. Hieronymus, the grandson of Hieron, thought fit to ally himself with Carthage, but he soon fell in a conspiracy. There was a fierce popular outbreak and more bloodshed. The conspirators were put to death, and Hieron's family was murdered, whilst the Carthaginian faction, under the pretense of delivering the city from its tyrants, got the upper hand and drew the citizens into open defiance of Rome. Claudius Marcellus was then in command of the Roman army in Sicily, and he threatened the Syracusans with attack unless they would get rid of Epictetus and Hippocrates, the heads of the anti-Roman faction. Marcellus struck his first blow at Leontini, which was quickly stormed, and its sack roused the feeling of the Syracusans against any negotiations with the Roman general, and putting themselves under Epictetus and Hippocrates, they closed their gates on him. Marcellus, after an unsuccessful attempt to negotiate, began the siege in regular form, 214 BC, and both the land and sea establishing a camp on Peloponnese, where stood the old temple of Olympian Zeus. But he made his chief assault on the northern side of the defenses of Tyche. The city was defended by a numerous soldiery, and by the ingenious contrivances of Archimedes, whose engines dealt havoc among the Roman ships and frustrated the attack on the fortifications on the northern slopes of Epipolae. Marcellus had recourse to a blockade, and at last, in 212, information was given to him that the Syracusans were celebrating a great festival to Artemis. Making use of this opportunity, he forced the Hexapylon entrance by night and established himself in Tyche and on the heights of Epipolae. The strong fortress of Euryalus held out for a time, but being now isolated, it soon had to surrender. The outer and the inner city of Thucydides still held out, whilst a Carthaginian fleet was moored out of Acrademia, and Carthaginian troops were encamped on the spot. But a pestilence broke out in the autumn of 212, which swept them clean away and thinned the Roman ranks. The ships sailed away to Carthage, and on their way back to Syracuse with supplies, they could not get beyond Cape Pycanus, owing to adverse winds, and they were confronted by a Roman fleet. All hope for the city being now at an end, the Syracusans threw themselves on the mercy of Marcellus. But Acradina and the island still held out, for a brief space under the Syracusan mercenaries, till one of their officers, a Spaniard, betrayed the latter position to the enemy, and, at the same time, Acradina was carried and taken. Marcellus gave the city up to plunder, and the art treasures in which it was so rich, many of the choicest of them, no doubt, were conveyed to Rome. Archimedes perished in the confusion of the sack, pursued his studies. Syracuse was now simply one of the provincial cities of Rome's empire. It retained much of its Greek character and many of its finest public buildings. Its importance and historic associations naturally marked it as the residence of the Roman praetor, or governor of Sicily. Cicero often speaks of it as a particularly splendid and beautiful city, as still in his own day the seat of art and culture. Caligula restored its decayed walls and some of its famous temples. It was plundered by Frankish pirates about 286 AD. In the 4th century, it is named by the poet Asinasis, chiefly, perhaps, on the strength of its historic memories, and there was a purple factory here under an imperial procurator. In 665, Herculius Constans fixed his capital here, but owing to his oppressive government was assassinated in 668. Syracuse has been a place of comparatively little importance since the year 878, when it was destroyed by the Saracens. On this day in history, May 22nd, 853, a Byzantine fleet sacks and destroys undefended Damietta in Egypt. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Damietta, a town of Lower Egypt on the eastern Damietta or Fatnatic branch of the Nile, a few miles above its mouth, and 125 miles north by northeast of Cairo by rail. Population, from 1937, 40,332. The town is built on the east bank of the river between it and Lake Menzala. Though ill-built and partly ruinous, the town possesses some fine mosques, with lofty minarets, public baths, and busy bazaars. Along the riverfront are many substantial houses with terraces and steps leading to the water. Their wooden lattices of saw-work are very graceful. Once the third town in Egypt, it enjoys now little more than a coasting trade, and ships of over 6 feet draught must anchor in the offing. Damietta is a Levantine corruption of the Coptic name Tamiati, Arabic Dumyat. The original town was 4 miles nearer to the sea than the modern city. Under the Saracens, it had great wealth and commerce, and, as the eastern bulwark of Egypt, was frequently attacked by the Crusaders. In June 1249, Louis IX of France occupied Damietta without opposition, but being defeated near Mansoura in the February following, and compelled, April 6th, to surrender himself prisoner, Damietta was restored to the Muslims as part of the ransom exacted. To prevent further attacks from the sea, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars blocked up the Fatinitic mouth of the Nile, about 1260, razed old Damietta to the ground, and transferred the inhabitants to the site of the modern town. Damietta gives its name to dimity, a kind of striped cloth, for which the place was at one time famous. Cotton and silk goods are still manufactured here, and there is some trade in rice and salted fish. On this day in history, May 23rd, 1430, Joan of Arc is captured at the siege of Compiègne by troops from the Burgundian faction. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Compiègne, a town of northern France, capital of an arrondissement, department of Oise, 52 miles north by northeast of Paris, famous for its chateau, park, and forest. Population, from 1936, 17,929. The town, which is a favorite summer resort, stands on the northwest border of the forest of Compiègne and on the left bank of the Oise, near its confluence with the Aisne. The river is crossed by a bridge built in the reign of Louis XV. Compiègne, or Compendium, seems originally to have been a hunting lodge of the early Frankish kings. It was enriched by Charles the Bald with 2 castles, and a Benedictine abbey dedicated to Saint Corneille, the monks of which retained down to the 18th century the privilege of acting for 3 days as lords of Compiègne, with full judicial privileges. It was in Compiègne that King Louis I, the Dominaire, was deposed in 833, and at the siege of the town in 1430 Joan of Arc was taken prisoner by the English. A monument to her faces the Hôtel de Ville. The Treaty of Compiègne, between Richelieu and the Dutch, was signed there in 1624. In 1814, Compiègne offered a stubborn resistance to the Prussian troops. Under Napoleon III, it was the annual resort of the court during the hunting season. From 1870 to 1871, it was one of the headquarters of the German army. The town was occupied by the Germans in 1914 and was bombarded in 1918. The armistice of November 11, 1918 was signed there in a dining car. During World War II, the Germans again occupied the town in June 1940. The Franco-German armistice of June 22, 1940 was signed in the same dining car at Compiègne. Later, the Germans moved the car to Berlin. The Hôtel de Ville, with a graceful facade surmounted by a lofty belfry, is late Gothic, early 16th century. Of the churches, St. Antoine, 13th century and 16th century, has some fine Renaissance stained glass, and St. Jacques dates from the 13th and 15th centuries. There are remains of the ancient abbey of St. Corneille. Compiègne, from a very early period until 1870, was the occasional residence of the French kings. Its magnificent palace, chateau, now an art museum, was erected chiefly by Louis XV and restored by Napoleon I. It has two facades, one overlooking the town, the other facing a fine park and a forest, 55 square miles. Compiègne is the seat of a sub-prefect, and has tribunals of first instance and of commerce. Industries are boat building, rope making, cooperage, and copper and iron founding. Asparagus is cultivated in the environs. There is river-borne trade in timber and coal. Telephone, accessories, parachutes, etc. are manufactured. On this day in history, May 24th, 919, the nobles of Franconia and Saxony elect Henry the Fowler at the imperial diet in Fritzlar as king of the East Frankish kingdom. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Henry. Henry I, born around 876, died 936, surnamed the Fowler, German king, son of Otto the Illustrious, Duke of Saxony, shared in early life in various campaigns for the defense of Saxony. He married Hatburg, a daughter of Erwin, Count of Merseburg, but as she had taken the veil on the death of her former husband, this union was declared illegal by the church, and in 909 he married Matilda, daughter of a Saxon count named Theodoric, and a reputed descendant of the hero Widukind. On his father's death in 912, he became Duke of Saxony, which he defended against the Slavs. In 918, the German king Conrad I advised the nobles to make the Saxon duke his successor. The Franks and the Saxons met at Fritzlar in May 919 and chose Henry as German king. The new king refused to allow his election to be sanctioned by the church. His authority, save in Saxony, was merely nominal, but he secured a recognition of his sovereignty from the Bavarians and the Swabians. In 921, Charles III of France recognized Henry as the king of the East Franks, and when in 923 the French king was taken prisoner by Herbert, Count of Vermandois, Lorraine came under Henry's authority, and Giselbert, who married his daughter Gerberga, was recognized as duke. Henry reduced various Slavonic tribes in the east to subjection, took Bernabor, the modern Brandenburg, from the Haveli, and secured both banks of the Elbe for Saxony. In 923 he had bought a truce for 10 years with the Hungarians by a promise of tribute, and on its expiration he gained 2 great victories over them in 933 at Checkaberg and Ried. The Danes were defeated, and territory as far as the Ader secured for Germany, and the king sought further to extend his influence by entering into relations with the kings of England, France, and Burgundy. He died at Memleben on July 2, 936. By his first wife, Hatburg, he left a son, Thankmar, who was excluded from the succession as illegitimate, and by Matilda he left 3 sons, the eldest of whom, Otto, afterwards the Emperor Otto the Great, succeeded him, and 2 daughters. Henry undertook only such enterprises as he was able to carry through. Laying more stress on his position as Duke of Saxony than King of Germany, he conferred great benefits on his duchy. The founder of her town life and the creator of her army, he ruled in harmony with her nobles and secured her frontiers from attack. On this day in history, May 25th, 1798, as part of the United Irishmen Rebellion, the Battle of Carlow begins. Executions of suspected rebels at Carnew and at Dunlavin Green take place. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Carlow, county town, of the county of Carlow, Era, on the River Barrow. Population of the urban district of 1936, 7,649. Little of the castle now remains. In the reign of Edward III, the king's exchequer was removed thither, and money applied to building town walls. Early in Elizabeth's reign, Rory O'Gomore burned the town. Carlow submitted to Ireton in 1641, and was attacked in the insurrection of 1798. It obtained a charter of incorporation in the 13th century, and was reincorporated by James I, returning 2 members to the Irish Parliament. 2 miles northeast of the town is an important dolmen, and 3 miles west is the church of Killishan of Norman and pre-Norman date. Brewing, flour, milling, dairying, and the manufacture of beet sugar are important. On this day in history, May 26, 1869, Boston University is chartered by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the educational institutions of the city. Boston is the center of a large district in which many notable educational institutions are situated. Just beyond the city limits in Cambridge are Harvard University, which, while never in Boston, has had a profound influence on Boston life, Radcliffe College, for women, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which was formerly in Boston. Boston College, the great Jesuit college, is now located in Newton. Tufts College at Medford and Wellesley College at Wellesley are not far away. In Boston proper is Boston University, with its numerous colleges and schools, the schools of medicine, dentistry, and public health, the Graduate School of Business Administration, the Bussey Institution for graduate work and research in applied biology, and the Arnold Arboretum, a botanical garden, all of Harvard University. The Soldiers Field, with its great stadium where the principal athletic contests take place, is also situated in the city just across the river from Cambridge. Here also is Simmons College for Women, Wentworth Institute for Technical, Mechanical, and Training, Emerson College for Men and Women, Northeastern University connected with the Young Men's Christian Association, Suffolk University, and the Portia College and Portia Law School for Women. On this day in history, May 27th, 1153, Malcolm IV becomes King of Scotland. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Malcolm IV, circa 1141 to 65, was the eldest son of Henry, Earl of Huntingdon, died 1152, son of King David I, and succeeded his grandfather David as King of Scotland in 1153. He died unmarried on December 9th, 1165. On this day in history, May 28th, 1644, as part of the English Civil War, the Bolton Massacre by Royalist troops under the command of James Stanley, 7th Earl of Derby, occurs. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Bolton, or Bolton-le-Moors, municipal, county, and parliamentary borough, Lancashire, England, 11 miles northwest of Manchester, population of 1891, 146,487, population of 1938, 169,400, areas 23.9 square miles. It is served by the LMS Railway and divided by the Crowle, a small tributary of the Irwell, into Great and Little Bolton, while, as the name implies, it is surrounded by high moorland. Although of early origin, its appearance, like that of many great manufacturing towns of the vicinity, is wholly modern. The earliest forms of the name is Boldleton or Bothleton. The manor was granted by William I to Roger de Puctu, and passed through the families of Ferrers and Pilkington to the Harringtons of Hornby Castle, who lost it with their other estates for their adherence to Richard III. In 1485, Henry VII granted it to the first Earl of Derby. The manor of Little Bolton seems to have been, at least from Henry III's reign, distinct from that of Great Bolton, and was held till the 17th century by the Bothletons, or Boltons. the site of the Church of St. Peter has long been occupied by a parish church. There was one there in the 12th century, but the existing building only dates from 1870. In 1251, William de Ferrers obtained from the crown a charter for a weekly market and a yearly fair, but gradually this annual fair was replaced by 4 others chiefly for horses and cattle. The New Year and Whitsuntide Show fairs arose only during the 19th century. During the Civil War, Bolton sided with the Parliament, and in 1643 and 1644 the Royalist forces assaulted the town. In the early days, Bolton was famous for its woolen manufactures. In Richard I's reign, an almoner, whose duty it was to measure and stamp all bundles of woolen goods, was appointed. The industry flourished so greatly that when, in 1566, deputies were appointed to assist the almoners, Bolton is again named. Leland, in his itinerary, 1558, recorded the fact that Bolton made cottons, which were in reality woolen goods. Real cotton goods were not made in Lancashire till 1641, when Bolton is named as the chief seat of the manufacture of fustians, vermilions, and dimities. Velvets were first made here about 1756 by Jeremiah Clark, and muslins and cotton quiltings in 1763. The inventors of spinning machinery, Arkwright and Crompton, were both born in the parish. Spinning factories were erected, the first in Bolton, about 1780. In 1851, there were 66 cotton mills with 860,000 throstle spindles at work. The cognate industry of bleaching has been carried on since early in the 18th century, and large ironworks grew up in the latter half of the 19th century. In 1791, a canal was constructed from Manchester to Bolton, and by an Act of Parliament, 1792, Bolton Moor was enclosed. On this day in history, May 29th, 1176, at the Battle of Legnano, the Lombard League defeats Emperor Friedrich I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Legnano, a town of Lombardy, Italy, province of Milan, 17 miles northwest of it by rail, 682 feet above sea level. Population from 1936, 31,959. The Church of St. Magno, built in the style of Vermont by Lampognano, 1504 to 1529, contains an altarpiece by Luini. There are also remains of a castle of the Visconti. Legnano is the seat of an important cotton, especially cotton finishing, and silk industries, with machine shops, boilerworks, and dyeing. Close by, the Lombard League defeated Frederick Barbarossa in 1176. A monument to commemorate the battle was erected on the field in 1876. Another by Buti, erected in 1900, is in the Piazza Federico Barbarossa. The battle is of significance in military history as foreshadowing the end of the great era of cavalry supremacy. Friedrich, in the spring of 1176, sending for reinforcements from South Germany, planned a determined effort to crush the League of the Guelph cities. With a small body of knights, he marched to Como to meet these reinforcements and then sought to regain his headquarters at Pavia by a circuit road, the enemy stronghold of Milan. Meanwhile, however, the Milanese had rallied to them large contingents of their allies and, quitting Milan, placed themselves astride Friedrich's route. He attacked at once, despite his inferiority of numbers, and his cavalry scattered the Lombard cavalry, then pressing on to attack the infantry mass, which lay in the rear. But their charge was brought to a standstill by the close-knit ranks of the Milanese pikemen. Their resistance allowed their own cavalry to rally, and these, reinforced by the arrival of a fresh body from Brescia, charged the flank of Friedrich's cavalry. Friedrich himself was unhorsed, and his troops thereupon broke and fled. The small body of infantry, furnished by the citizen militia of Como, were slaughtered or captured without difficulty. Friedrich, however, managed to escape and reach Pavia. On the Lombard side, the battle had given an illustration of the possibilities of a staunch infantry body as a stable pivot to the mobile arm. On this day in history, May 30th, 70 AD, during the siege of Jerusalem, Titus and his Roman legions breached the second wall of Jerusalem. Jewish defenders retreat to the first wall. The Romans build a circumvallation, cutting down all trees within 15 kilometers, or 9.3 miles. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Jerusalem during the times of Titus and Hadrian. The Romans would not allow the work to continue, and when Titus besieged Jerusalem in 70, the wall was not complete. Titus, attacking from the north, captured successively the third and second walls, Antonia, the temple, and the upper city. It is probable that his orders for the complete destruction of the temple and fortifications, with the exception of the 3 towers, were not carried out. The Roman garrison which he left remained at Jerusalem until the Jewish War of Freedom under Bar Kokhba in 132. Following the defeat of the Jews, Jerusalem was devastated more completely than by Titus. The site was plowed over and a new city, Aelia Capitolina, so called in honor of Aelius Hadrianus, was built over the ruins. From this, Jews were excluded. But Christians, who had not sided with the Jews, might enter. Temples were dedicated to Bacchus, Venus, and Serapis, and over the former sanctuary a shrine of Jupiter Capitolinus was reared. A boar, the symbol of the 10th Legion, was placed over the southern gate. Other buildings now constructed were the theatre, the Demosia, the Tetranymphon, the Dodecapelon, and the Kodra. For 2 centuries, little is known of Jerusalem. In 326, Constantine ordered Bishop Macarius to recover the sites of the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. 2 great churches were built, one of which, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, stood where its present namesake stands. Of the Basilica of the Cross, no trace remains. In 460, the Empress Eudocia repaired the walls and extended them so as to include Siloam, building also churches. Of these, one, above the Siloam Pool, was recovered by F.J. Bliss. Another, over the reputed tomb of Stephen, north of the Damascus Gate, was recovered in 1874. Justinian's Basilica, with adjacent hospitals for the sick and for pilgrims, built in the 6th century, is described by Procopius. This building probably occupied the so-called Tomb of David. In 614, Khosrow II of Persia captured Jerusalem and damaged many buildings, including the Church of the Sepulchre. Heraclius defeated Khosrow and re-entered Jerusalem in 629. In 637, Omar ousted the Romans, but was careful not to harm the city. He built a wooden mosque, which the Caliph Abdul Malik rebuilt in 688. The mosque is El-Aqsa. Abdul Malik also constructed the Dome of the Rock, Kubet-es-Sakar, or Mosque of Omar. In 1099, the Crusaders under Godfrey of Bouillon entered Jerusalem, and a terrible carnage ensued. Jerusalem became the capital of the Latin Kingdom, until Saladin reconquered it in 1187, and repaired the walls. Soon after 1167, Benjamin of Tudela visited Jerusalem and left a description of the city in his itinerary. Excepting from 1229 to 39 and 1243 to 44, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands until its capture, 1917, by Allenby. In 1517, Salim I of Turkey took Jerusalem from the Egyptians. The present configuration of the walls is due to him. As a result of the World War, Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, a mandated territory of the British Empire. On this day in history, May 31st, 1790, the United States enacts its first copyright statute, the Copyright Act of 1790. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over copyright within the United States. The protection of copyright by statute in the United States began with the enactment by the state of Connecticut in January 1783 and by the state of Massachusetts in March of the same year, of acts which gave copyright for a term of 14 years, with the right of a 14-year renewal if the authors were living at the expiration of the first term. This action was a result of a vigorous crusade by Noah Webster. Before May 1786, 10 more states had passed copyright acts for varying terms. These acts followed in principle and substantially in form the English statute of 1710, known as the Act of Queen Anne. Prior to the organization of the states in 1783, what protection had been enjoyed in America by authors had to be secured in the colonies, as in Great Britain, under the principles of common law. In 1790, the U.S. Congress, influenced in large by the arguments of Noah Webster and other literary workers, enacted the first national statute. This act gave to authors who were citizens or residents, and to their heirs and assigns, copyright protection for books, maps, and charts for a term of 14 years, with the right to renewal for 14 years more at the expiration of that time. The statute provided for the deposit before publication of a printed title page in the clerk's office of the local U.S. District Court. It provided further for the advertising of the book, with specification of the copyright entry 4 times within the first 2 months after publication. Requirement was made for the deposit within 6 months of publication of a copy of the book with the U.S. Secretary of State. The penalties imposed upon a printer of an unauthorized impression of the book so copyrighted included the forfeiture of his piratical copies and a fine of 50 cents for each sheet that was found. Half of this fine went to the owner of the copyright and half to the United States. The statute also made provision, in confirmation of rights existing under common law, against the unauthorized publication of manuscripts. This original act was followed by the Act of 1802, which required the record of copyright to be printed on or following the title page. The same requirement was made for designs, engravings, and etchings entered for copyright. The statute of 1819 gave the U.S. Circuit Courts original jurisdiction in cases of copyright. The Acts of 1831, which was, in substance, a consolidation of the previous acts, included a provision for the protection of musical compositions. The term was extended to 28 years, with renewal for 14 years to the author, his widow, or his children. The requirement of newspaper notice, except in the case of renewals, was cancelled. This statute confirmed the requirement for the deposit of a copy with the U.S. District Clerk. This copy to be transmitted to the Secretary of State within 3 months after publication. The Act of 1834 required that record in the court of original entry should be made of any assignment of the copyright. In 1846, the Smithsonian Institute was established by Act of Congress. This act making provision for the delivery of 1 copy of a book securing copyright to the library of this institution. The same act provided for the delivery of 1 copy of the copyrighted book to the Library of Congress. This was important because depositing and cataloging these books in the Library of Congress, a requirement confirmed in all subsequent acts, made it practicable after 1846 to secure prompt and trustworthy information from the library and, in later years, from the bureaus of copyright connected with the library as to the status of the copyright of any literary work. The publication desiring to ascertain whether or not a book is in the public domain or who is the recorded owner of the copyright made application under the Act of 1846 to the Librarian of Congress, and since the establishment of the Bureau of Copyright makes application to the Register of the Bureau and secures for a fee of $1 the information required. The opportunity of ascertaining the precise status of literary productions, which has been entered for copyright, is of assured convenience and importance to the publishers and to the book-buying public. The U.S. Act of 1856 secured to dramatists the protection for the right of performance. The Act of 1859 made the Interior Department, instead of the State Department, the custodian of copyright. The Act of 1861 provided for an appeal to the Supreme Court in all copyright cases, irrespective of the estimated value of the property in question. For other than copyright appeals, it is required that the property in question shall have value of not less than $5,000. The Act of 1865 again placed under the control of the Library of Congress the copies of books deposited in connection with the entry of copyright. The deposit had to be made within 1 month from publication. The provision covers not only books, but works of art, photographs, and negatives. An amendment in 1867 provided for a penalty of $25 in the case of failure to deposit within the month specified. 12 acts having to do with copyright had become law prior to 1870. That year brought a general act which provided protection not only for works of literature, but for paintings, drawings, statues, chromos, models, or designs, and superseded previous statutes. This act canceled the control by the local district courts of the system of registry, and made the Librarian of Congress the copyright officer. It was required that the printed title page of the book be filed in his office before publication, and 2 copies deposited within 10 days after publication. The application of copyright law, unlike that regarding patents, is solely a question for the courts. The Librarian of Congress is simply an officer of record and makes no decisions. In 1874, An amendatory act made legal a short form of record, copyright 18-by AB, and the protection of the label designs was transferred to the Patent Office. In 1879, the Appropriation Bill of the U.S. Post Office contained a provision prohibiting the transmission of any publication that violated copyright. In 1891, after a campaign extending over many years, a copyright measure providing international copyright became law. The first attempt to bring about international copyright had been made by a committee instituted in 1837 by George P. Putnam, who all his life worked actively for the establishment of copyright relations between the United States and the other literature-producing nations of the world.